Bacon is one of the easiest foods in America to trust too quickly because the package does half the thinking for you. It gives you smokehouse words, farmhouse colors, a little red barn fantasy, maybe a black label, maybe a wooden table, maybe a proud script font that whispers old-school breakfast tradition. And the average shopper sees all that, tosses it in the cart, and assumes they're buying something simple. Pork, salt, smoke, maybe a cure, done. But that is not what a huge part of the bacon aisle is really selling anymore. What it often sells is the feeling of old-fashioned bacon, while the actual product drifts further into a managed, standardized, moisture-loaded, flavor-corrected strip built for shelf performance and brand familiarity more than honest pork character. That gap matters because bacon is one of those foods where people think premium and authentic are obvious on sight. Usually they're not. And once you start reading the aisle with a colder eye, the category gets uncomfortable fast. Because the issue is not just whether it comes from pork. The issue is whether it still behaves like real bacon, tastes like real bacon, and reads like real bacon once you get past the front of the pack. So for this list, real pork means something very specific. It means bacon that still feels anchored in the meat itself, not mainly in added water, flavor smoothing, branding theater, or convenience engineering. It means a package where the pork is doing the heavy lifting, where the strip doesn't have to be rescued by hype words, where the fat renders instead of flooding, where the smell coming off the pan is smoke and meat before sweetness and flavoring. That does not mean every stripped-down label is automatically noble, and it does not mean every mainstream brand is inedible. It means if you want bacon that actually feels like buying pork instead of buying a bacon impression, most of the aisle falls apart under pressure. And that is why this list is not about fake outrage, it is about false confidence. These are 10 bacon brands I would skip if you care about clarity, character, and getting something closer to actual pork, followed by the 4 labels that still make the category feel honest. Start with great value. The label suggests the classic bargain logic everybody knows. Same breakfast, lower price, no big sacrifice. And that is exactly how store-brand bacon wins. It doesn't ask you to think, it asks you to assume bacon is bacon. But budget bacon is often where the category's compromises become easiest to see. You open the pack and the strips can look unusually uniform, wet, and thin in a way that tells you the product was designed to hit a price before it was designed to feel memorable. In the pan, what should be rendering can turn into a lot of shrink, a lot of curl, and a lot of that discouraging moment where you realize half your breakfast was water management and fat loss. The trust gap here is not dramatic, it's ordinary. The branding says practical family staple. The eating experience often says process to a target. If you buy bacon rarely and only want a salty breakfast side, maybe that trade feels acceptable. If you actually want bacon to taste like pork and smoke instead of price optimization, this is one of the first packs to leave behind. Then there's Sugardale. The front of the pack usually leans into exactly what the brand name wants you to feel. Sweetness, comfort, old American breakfast nostalgia. The kind of bacon that belongs next to pancakes in a commercial kitchen ad from decades ago. But that image creates a soft focus illusion. When bacon branding leans heavily into sugar, comfort, and easy appeal, it often tells you something important about the product's role. It is not trying to be a clean expression of pork. It is trying to be highly agreeable. That sounds harmless until you remember how many shoppers mistake agreeable for higher quality. Bacon should not need a candy-coated identity to seem enjoyable. When a strip smells more like a breakfast glaze than a cured cut, when the flavor feels rounded to the point of blandness, when the profile gets carried by sweetness instead of depth, the pack may still deliver calories and crunch, but it stops feeling like an honest meat purchase. It starts feeling like a breakfast-flavored product with pork in the background. That is a very different standard. Oscar Mayer is where the label confidence problem becomes almost perfect. Few brands in the aisle feel more familiar, more culturally settled, more beyond question than Oscar Mayer. For a lot of people, this is not just bacon. This is the memory of bacon, which is exactly why it deserves more scrutiny, not less. The label suggests default trust, mainstream reliability, and a product that has already passed some invisible cultural test, because everybody recognizes it. But recognition is not the same thing as integrity. Mass familiarity often means a product has been tuned to offend nobody, surprise nobody, and work inside an enormous manufacturing system that values consistency above personality. That can show up in strips that cook out faster than you expect, texture that lands somewhere between crisp and papery, and a flavor profile that feels strangely flattened, like the brand has decided what people think bacon should taste like and then engineered the strip to stay inside that lane forever. This is the kind of pack that teaches shoppers the wrong lesson. It teaches them that if a label feels established enough, the back of the pack must be fine. That assumption is how weak bacon keeps winning. Farmland sells a different fantasy. It tells you, right in the name, that you are closer to the source, closer to fields, closer to origin, closer to something less industrial. The label doesn't just sell bacon, it sells distance from the factory. But name choices like that deserve a second look, because farm language in grocery marketing often does the same job as craft paper textures and wood print graphics. It gives your brain a shortcut to trust. The problem is that trust should come from clarity, not scenery. When a label leans hard on heritage and place, but the product itself still reads like a standard supermarket bacon engineered for broad distribution, the contrast starts to matter. Real pork character is usually a little less polished. It has variation. It has a more believable balance between meat and fat. It feels less like it was smoothed into brand consistency. If a pack wants you picturing a smokehouse but delivers the same generic, highly managed grocery strip you could pull from 5 different shelves, then the front did more work than the pork did. That is exactly the kind of mismatch this list is trying to expose. Now pause on something, because this is where the aisle stops making sense. The more country, farm, homestyle, and handcrafted language you see on modern bacon, the less you should relax. Not because every such label is bad, but because the category has learned how powerful those words are. Bacon sells reassurance before it sells information. And that means the front of the package is often a decoy. Once you see that, the rest of the shelf gets easier to read. Smithfield is another brand that often gets a pass because it sounds large, established, meat-focused, and serious. The label suggests scale as competence. People assume a major pork name should mean a stronger bacon product. But size can also mean the opposite of what the shopper imagines. It can mean more systems, more standardization, more pressure to make a pack behave identically in thousands of stores and kitchens, even if that consistency comes at the expense of texture and character. With bacon, that trade-off shows up in subtle but revealing ways. The strips can look fine while raw, but feel strangely anonymous once cooked. The aroma comes up, but it lacks that dense, savory identity that makes you immediately think, yes, that is pork. Instead, it can drift toward generic smoky saltiness, the kind that works well enough in a sandwich, but doesn't hold your attention on its own. That is the recurring issue with industrial bacon at this scale. It is not that it fails dramatically. It is that it quietly lowers your expectations and then teaches you to call that normal. Kroger and a lot of its private label bacon lines deserve a mention for the same reason Great Value did, but with a different trick. The label often suggests an upgrade path. Maybe not luxury, but a slightly more thoughtful grocery store pick. Slightly better design, slightly more premium wording, slightly more confidence that you found the smarter shelf option without actually leaving the mainstream tier. That is a powerful retail move, because it lets shoppers feel selective while still staying inside a system built on convenience and pricing pressure. The issue is that these middle-tier private labels often market discernment more than they deliver it. They split the difference between budget bacon and true specialty bacon. But what you get can still land much closer to the first one. Visually, the slices may look like an improvement. In practice, the eating experience can still flatten into salt, smoke cue, and collapse. If you are paying extra for a label that mostly improved the packaging story, not the pork story, that is not a win. That is premium theater at store brand scale. Bar S is where the front and back gap becomes hard to ignore. The label sells straight utility. Cheap, available, familiar, no romance needed. And in a strange way, That honesty almost makes it easier to forgive. But not enough to recommend. Budget bacon at this end of the aisle often stops pretending to be a crafted food and starts functioning like a processed breakfast component. The strips can come out looking crowded, compressed, and overly eager to either burn at the edges or vanish in the middle. The chew can feel thin, the flavor can feel more like salt and smoke concept than bacon depth. This is the kind of product that reminds you how much shoppers have normalized disappointment in the category. If a bacon strip shrinks into a brittle, greasy ribbon that adds little beyond generic breakfast intensity, then you are not really buying pork in the spirit most people imagine. You are buying a low-cost strip built to satisfy the word bacon at the lowest acceptable threshold. Those are not the same thing. Armour works differently. The brand name suggests strength, solidity, maybe even an older era of meat confidence. It sounds durable, reassuring. Industrial, yes, but dependable. The trouble is that dependability in mass-market processed meat often means a product that has been stripped of risk and stripped of distinction at the same time. With bacon, the warning sign is when everything about the product feels pre-decided. The color looks like what bacon is supposed to look like. The slices are arranged like what bacon is supposed to be. The smell hits the right notes, but none of it feels alive. None of it feels like pork still leading the conversation. It feels like a controlled performance of bacon. That may sound abstract until you cook enough brands side by side. Then it becomes obvious. Some strips render and deepen, others simply perform. Armour too often lands in the second group. The label offers meat authority. The experience often offers processed predictability. Dailies is a good example of a brand that can fool more careful shoppers because it often presents itself with just enough smokehouse energy to look like the smarter pick. It feels like it should sit one tier above the weakest supermarket options. And sometimes, that is exactly why people stop reading closely. They think they have already done the filtering. But packaging that cues smoke, thickness, or craftsmanship can create a very specific blind spot. It makes the shopper assume texture and flavor integrity before the pan confirms anything. Then the product cooks, and the promise narrows fast. You may get a bigger strip, a more assertive aroma, even a more dramatic visual presence in the skillet, but that alone does not make it honest bacon. Some packs in this class are basically louder, not better. Bigger branding, bigger smoke suggestion, bigger breakfast identity, but the underlying product can still feel tuned, not natural. Still constructed around what people want bacon to signal, not what excellent pork bacon actually has to say on its own. Hormel Black Label might be the most instructive brand on this whole list because it shows how effective premium-coated supermarket design has become. The name itself is brilliant. Black Label. It sounds selective. It sounds like the shelf version of choosing the good bottle from behind the counter. And that is exactly the psychological move. The label tells you this is not ordinary bacon. This is the serious one. But serious design is not the same thing as serious pork. Black packaging logic has trained shoppers in almost every category to mistake darker colors for higher standards. In bacon, that can be a trap. What matters is whether the product actually feels more anchored in the cut itself or just more polished in how it presents industrial bacon to you. Too often, labels like this deliver a front-of-pack mood upgrade, while the back-of-pack reality stays inside the same broad supermarket logic. Engineered consistency, broad appeal, easy salt-smoke gratification, and not much mystery beyond that. This is the bacon equivalent of paying more for the costume. And the number one brand I would skip for shoppers chasing real pork is Smithfield's more premium-style bacon positioning and, honestly, the entire class of bacon that hides behind upscale language while still behaving like a mass-market strip. I'm using Smithfield here because it represents that category extremely well. Established meat company, premium adjacent wording, enough presence to dominate a cooler door, enough design to make the shopper feel safe. The label suggests you solved the problem. You recognized the bigger name, avoided the bargain bin look, paid a little more, and therefore escaped compromise. But this is where the bacon aisle punishes assumptions the hardest. A slightly more expensive pack from a dominant national processor can still leave you with the same central disappointment. A product more optimized for category control than for pork character. And that is the deeper story of this entire list. The worst bacon buys are not always the obviously cheap ones. Sometimes they are the packs that understand your standards just well enough to imitate them. So if those are the 10 I would skip when the goal is actual pork character, what are the 4 labels that still feel closer to buying real bacon instead of buying bacon branding? Here is the relief section, and notice how different the logic becomes. The better options do not win because they scream harder. They win because they leave less to imagination. Right Brand is one of the first names that still often feels like the meat is allowed to exist as meat. The label suggests thickness, substance, and a more direct relationship between the strip and the animal it came from, and unlike a lot of bacon marketing, that promise is usually at least visible in the pan. The slices tend to look like they still came from a belly, not from a spreadsheet. They render with more dignity. The bite stays present. You taste fat and smoke and pork in a more believable order. Is it perfect purity? No. Is it still a branded grocery product? Of course. But when you compare it side by side with weaker supermarket bacon, the difference is not subtle. This is what happens when the strip still has some identity left. Pedersen's is another label that tends to appeal to ingredient-conscious shoppers for a reason. The front does not have to pretend as aggressively. It usually leads with simplicity, and simplicity is one of the few things in modern bacon worth paying attention to. When a brand wins trust by reducing the performance instead of increasing it, that matters. The product often feels like it was designed for people who actually read labels, not just people who react to smokehouse theater. You get a clearer sense of what you are buying, and that clarity changes the eating experience. The bacon is not trying to overwhelm you into thinking it is authentic. It just tries to read cleaner and cook cleaner. In a category full of inflated signals, that restraint is powerful. North Country Smokehouse is one of those brands that usually makes sense the moment you stop looking at the name and start looking at the product logic. Good bacon should not need a dramatic sales pitch if the structure is right. The slice, the fat ratio, the smell as it cooks, the way it crisps without disintegrating, all of that should do the talking. That is where this kind of label tends to separate itself. You are not buying an idea of old-fashioned bacon. You are buying something that behaves more like a recognizable cut of meat that happened to be cured and smoked, which is exactly what most shoppers think they were buying all along. That difference sounds small until you taste it. Then it feels like 2 different categories. And the fourth one is Nueske's. This is not the easiest or cheapest pick, and that is part of why it matters here. Real bacon has been pushed so far toward convenience and familiarity that many shoppers have forgotten what happens when the product is allowed to have presence. Nueske's tends to remind people. The aroma is deeper. The strip holds itself differently. The flavor feels like it came from somewhere, not like it was rounded into universal approval. This is not everyday cart bacon for every household, and it does not need to be. It earns its place because it proves the category can still produce something that feels like pork first, branding second. In a video like this, that matters more than hype ever could. Now, if you notice something, good. The better options were not defined by magical words, not by premium, not by thick cut alone, not by black packaging, not by barns, smoke shacks, plaid designs, or nostalgic fonts. They won because the story on the front matched the behavior in the pan more often. That is the entire game. Bacon is one of the clearest examples in the grocery store of how branding can train you to mistake atmosphere for substance. And once you see that, the category becomes much easier to navigate. Here is the practical framework I want you to remember the next time you're standing in that refrigerated aisle. First, stop asking whether the package looks trustworthy, and start asking whether it looks like it is trying too hard to create trust. Those are different questions. Second, imagine the product after the branding disappears. No barn graphic, no rustic font, no smokehouse language. If all that is left is a thin, glossy, highly managed strip that shrinks into itself, you probably paid for image. Third, watch for the gap between the emotional promise and the physical behavior. Real pork bacon should not feel anonymous once it cooks. If the smell is loud but the flavor is shallow, if the slices look big but finish small, if the whole experience feels like it was designed in reverse from a marketing brief, that pack belongs back on the shelf. Fourth, Remember that familiar is not the same thing as better. In bacon, familiar often just means the compromise has had more time to normalize itself. And maybe the biggest takeaway of all is this. The bacon aisle is not divided into good brands and evil brands. It is divided into labels that let the pork stay visible and labels that ask branding to cover the distance. That is a much more useful way to shop because it keeps you out of fake outrage and puts you back in the role of an actual buyer making better calls. You do not need a lecture, you need a lens. And the lens is simple. If the pack sells a whole lifestyle before it sells a believable strip of bacon, slow down. Because that is why this matters. People are not just getting tricked into buying bad bacon. They are getting trained to lower the standard for what honest food is supposed to feel like. They think they made the smarter breakfast choice because the label looked settled. American, premium, or familiar. But the smarter choice starts when you stop letting the front of the package finish the argument for you. So if you've got one of these brands in your fridge right now, I want to know which one and whether you still think it deserves the spot. And if you swear one of these skip labels is better than I gave it credit for, say it. The bacon aisle is full of strong opinions and a lot of misplaced trust, and that is exactly why this conversation matters. Drop the brand you think is the most overrated, the one you think still gets it right, and the category you want broken down next. Because once you start reading labels like this, breakfast stops looking simple in the best possible way.